The following events that I am about to tell you happened to me and my mother at separate times, and both stories still scare the life out of me today. But first, I need to give you some backstory. I live in a small town in Texas with less than 2,000 people. I am 19 right now, but both stories I am telling you occurred about 27 years apart from each other. The first story was when my mom was 18, and the second story was when I was 14. Side note, I don't feel comfortable using anyone's real names, so I'll just be using fake ones. The events of the first story happened during my mom's senior year of high school, so probably around 86 or 87. It was about mid-March, and my mom had the idea of celebrating since it was the start of spring break and also her best friend, Judy's, birthday. Her and her friends had the idea to go out to the local lake near our town. I can remember the lake relatively easily. It was roughly an hour and a half from the town I lived in, and my family used to be really big on the outdoors, so we would often go there during our summers to camp and swim and all that. Good times. Anyways, my mom was never a particularly paranoid person, but she was always one to be wary of her surroundings. She could always tell when something was off, and she would take any means necessary to protect herself. This would mean carrying around her pocket knife wherever she could. I don't think she ever thought she would need it. It was more of a precaution, but on this particular night she definitely did. She was out at the lake with her friends boozing, listening to music, swimming, and making out with their boyfriends and just having a good time. A couple of hours into their party, my mom had to use the bathroom. Coincidentally, they had set up camp far from where any of the designated porta potties were, so she just went out into the woods. She was stumbling around for a couple of minutes trying to find a good space when she heard the most unnerving and chilling sound she had ever heard. It sounded like a knife carving into a tree, but it was much, much more sinister. At first, she brushed it off, thinking it was one of her friends playing a joke on her. Plus, she was incredibly wasted anyways. She kept walking, but then she heard it again. Only this time, it was louder. Whoever it was making that sound was laughing too. The laugh was just faint enough where you might miss it if you weren't paying attention, but it was still just as terrifying. It was obvious to her that someone was trying to get her attention because the sounds stopped suddenly when the person realized she had noticed. She looked around confused for a couple of seconds until it hit her. She saw something moving in the trees a couple of feet away from her, like someone was crouched down so they wouldn't see her, but there was still what sounded like a scratching noise against the tree bark. That sobered her fast, and she reached for the knife in her pocket, only to remember that she had left it in her purse, which was sitting in her tent. She was completely crippled without the realization of what was happening. She couldn't move, until she had remembered the flashlight that she had taken out there with her. Automatically, the air around her illuminated, and in the distance she saw the steel metal of what looked like a machete glimmering against the light emerging from the bushes. Whoever was out there was taunting her. Again, she stood frozen in fear at what she was seeing. All she could mumble was something along lines of, "What? Who? What? Who?" Then the metal had started to shift as if the person was moving towards her, and my mom bolted back to the campsite. When she finally found her friends, she ran into her tent and retrieved the pocket knife. I don't know how she planned on defending herself in a machete-to-pocket knife fight, but I think she just clinged onto what protection she could. Her friends were trying to calm her down. Her boyfriend said he'd go and get whatever was there, but she protested, and eventually everything went back to the way it was, except nobody went into the woods to use the bathroom, and my mom didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, the teens had woken up to police sirens and tapes surrounding their camp. Some police officers had led them to a path that led up to the main road. My mom cried as she hugged my grandparents when she saw them. Everyone gave their statements, and the police informed them that the man that was out there had more than likely traveled to the spot after ending the life of a high school principal and attempting to assault his wife in a neighboring town a few hours before. Apparently, the guy had shot through the door of their house, hitting the principal, He also attempted to break down the door before the man's wife had threatened to call the cops. He ran off after that and traveled down to the lake. That's where he ran into my mom. While the police were searching the area, they found a machete laying on the ground, 2 hunting knives taped to 2 different trees, a Bowie knife, and a mix of a few energy pills and Jameson bottles next to what looked like dried vomit in the grass. They assumed that he had crouched in the bushes a few yards from where my mom and her friends were partying, waiting for someone to come in the woods to pee. Then, he would do God knows what to them. They told my mom she had left at exactly the right time because sometime after, he had thrown up, probably due to mixing the pills in the alcohol, and more than likely left the premises. During the trial, they found out the boy was planning this for months. He was apparently into the occult and other satanic stuff like that and had gotten a girl in a neighboring town pregnant shortly before the incident. Her parents were furious, and they had taken the first steps to ensuring he would be sent to prison as he was 18 and his girlfriend was only 16. He admitted going to their house, ringing their doorbell, ending the life of her dad and attempting to break in. After that, I guess he just went on a rampage. He wanted to take revenge on the people he thought deserved to die, ergo the popular jerks in their school. My mom was popular, but I don't think she ever was one of the mean types. There were other kids celebrating spring break at the lake that night, but my mom's friends were the first ones he came across. My mom was just at the wrong place at the wrong time. That event traumatized my mom for years. A little shy of 30 years later, my mom had drove me and some of my friends to the closest mall to celebrate my 14th birthday. We went through the day having fun, playing hide-and-seek in Sears. I know, lame, but there are so many places to hide in there. And shopping. That night, however, was a different story. My mom had just dropped us off back at home, and I remember asking her if we could go to the park, which was only a block away from my house. All of my friends were planning on staying with me that night anyways, so it's not like anyone had a curfew. A little context here, I'm a guy and most of my friends were girls at the time except for one, but I had just come out as gay to all my friends and I don't think their parents had any issues with them staying the night with me. That's not relevant to the story, I guess, but I just thought I would explain. My mom agreed to let us go, as long as we took our cell phones and headed home at an appropriate time, which we all agreed was about 1-ish in the morning. The night was cool and chilled and we stood hanging off the playground equipment telling scary stories. They were all the basic run-of-the-mill stories about some stupid girl being stalked by a crazy psycho on Friday the 13th and stuff like that, which now that I think about it, sounds kind of like what happened to my mom, I guess. So none of us were really that scared. Then I told them all the story of what had happened to my mom. None of them really took me seriously until my friend Nicole reminded us of those incidents that happened around the same time. She then reminded us that the killer, who had kind of become a figment of local folklore in our town, had been released on probation. We were all thoroughly freaked out by that fact, but it was made even worse when one of my other guys, Brandon, noticed something from the road. Guys? We all looked up to see a black truck, I couldn't tell the make or model, starting to head down the street parallel to us. Now, our park is more of just a large square plot with streets facing each side of it, so cars passing by was not a strange occurrence. But usually those cars would just turn around another street off of the perimeter of the plot. This one didn't do that. The truck had entered the square on the street that was facing us, and we watched it as it turned onto all of the 4 streets surrounding. He wasn't going the speed limit either. He was just cruising like he was watching us. Now, like I said, this town was small, so when a car circles like that, it's usually just some high school kids looking to smoke and chill out or something and make sure no one was around to see. But no one ever really wants to know what goes down when those cars stop. But like I said, this guy was going so much slower than he should have been, plus it was 1 a.m. and it didn't feel right. At that moment, we all agreed that the situation was just too creepy and it was probably best to get out of there and head on back to my house. That's when the car stopped on the same side we had noticed it on. The guy's truck was parked almost right in front of the turn to the street where my house is, so we decided to go the opposite way and just circle back around to my block so we wouldn't have to pass that truck. But that's when I heard a demanding voice yell at us from the driver's seat. I couldn't get a good glimpse of him, but from what I could see, he was a man that looked to be somewhere around my mom's age. All he said was, "Ian, come on boy, it's getting late." Thinking he was probably just looking for a dog or something, we all kept walking. "Ian, I said get in the car, boy." He shouted again. That really just confused the crap out of us. I looked back at all of my friends just to make sure. It was just Nicole, Brandon, Sarah, Jenny, and me. No Ian. In that moment, I made what may have been the single dumbest mistake of my life and shouted back at him. "We don't know an Ian, sir. None of us are named Ian." At that moment, the creep started to get out of his car, and that was it. Nicole and I booked it out of there, not really looking back to see if any of our friends were following us. We ran straight for my house, and as the man saw us run, he got back in his truck and slammed the door. We ran right past him, which was a stupid thing to do in retrospect, but it was just a straight shot to my house after that. I could feel the air tightening in my lungs as I raced back to my house. I'm pretty sure I never ran that hard in my life. I probably should have waited for some of my friends to join just to make sure that they were okay, but I just assumed that they were right behind us. When we reached my house, I locked the door, and then told Nicole to get my mom and dad and some knives from our kitchen. Honestly, that was probably a bit of an overreaction, but I was scared out of my mind, and I just thought it was so bizarre that that weirdo thought it would be necessary to get out of his car to just talk to us. A couple of seconds later, after my friends had joined us in my living room and my parents had come from upstairs, we explained what had happened. My mom and dad calmed us down, and they said they'd keep the gun from our gun safe in their closet, just in case. Nothing ever came of that night, but none of us got any sleep. That night, I kept having an awful feeling. I thought about the trauma my mom had gone through all of those years ago, feeling like there had to be some kind of connection to what had just happened. It all seemed too weird. The next morning, my fears were realized. I was scrolling through my Facebook feed on my phone when I found an article on a local Crime Stoppers page. It had read, "Glenn Miller, local serial killer set to be released on parole on December the 12th. That was roughly 3 weeks before my birthday. My heart stopped as I kept reading. Apparently after he was released, as the article explained, he had went to live with his son, who his girlfriend had given birth to after he was arrested. His name was Ian, and there was a picture of him standing next to a black truck. I knew this had to be some kind of sick coincidence, but I could not shake the feeling that that was the truck we had seen all that night. This incident still terrifies me today, knowing that I could have met a fate that my mom almost did, 27 years before. So this was around a year ago now, and I'm writing this down so I can try and move past this horror ordeal. To start, I'm a 21-year-old female from England and live in a fairly small town. I met my ex, we'll call him Jay for privacy reasons, and the fact that I don't want him to read this and come and find me. I met Jay when I was 16 and started my first job at a pizza place. He seemed like a nice guy, but I was in a relationship at the time and saw him purely as a friend. He used to give me lifts home when it was dark and even buy me cigarettes or food if I was strapped for cash. My relationship ended 2 years after, and I had moved on to work at a pub in the next town over, and Jay appeared in my life again after pulling up at the bus stop where I was waiting and offered me a lift to work. I gladly accepted, as it had been around a year since we had last spoken, and was happy to catch up. After he dropped me off at work, we agreed we would speak again and possibly meet up. After that, he paid me regular visits at work and asked me when we were going to meet up. We agreed to go out drinking one night with one of our mutual friends, and on that night out, one thing led to another, and we ended up sleeping together. He took me home the next day and we continued to meet up regularly, go out in the car, meet up with friends, or just watch movies. Eventually he started taking me to work every day and taking me home as he said he wanted to make sure I was safe. It became easier that I would stay with him, so I began to basically live with him at his parents' house. Me and his family didn't get on for some reason, so they all took an instant disliking to me, so we eventually moved in with my parents. We had been together less than a year, but things were moving pretty fast. He wanted us to get our own place, and I agreed, having always wanted a place of my own, and I did really like him, and thought even if things didn't work out romantically, he would be a good roommate. We agreed on these terms that we would get a place together, but if things didn't work out, we would carry out our lease and then move on from there. We began looking for places when his dad became suddenly ill and died a day or so later. It was such a shock, no one saw it coming, and no one took it harder than Jay did. The craziest part was that an hour or so after his dad had died, we went to walk his dogs and he proposed to me. So this was in early November, and we had only been together since July the same year, and he had previously brought up marriage with me, but I had insisted it was too soon and I was too young. I know it's crazy, but in his current state, I didn't feel like I could say no, so I agreed to his proposal. We moved into our 2-bedroom flat in February and began living together quite happily, and had agreed on a long engagement, which suited me not wanting to get married so young, and also he wasn't hurt by any rejection. However, after a month or so of living together, I started to notice him change. He became moody and short with me, like I was constantly irritating him, and didn't like it when I went out with my friends without him, and I later found out that he was going through my phone while I slept. I just accepted what he wanted, as every time I tried to argue with him about things, he would apologize and say he was grieving his father, and would end up feeling sorry for him and guilty for getting angry. However, things soon got out of hand when I reconnected with an old friend. We'll call him P. P and I had fallen out a year before over our differences in his drinking habits. I worked with him, and he would often get drunk and not turn up for work, so I would cover his shifts. We got into an argument one day when I couldn't cover his shift and didn't speak for around a year. It was a pretty bad argument, but he got help with his drinking and reached out to me to apologize for his behavior. Jay didn't like this. He insisted that I didn't speak to P and would constantly look over my shoulder when I was texting him, and would become angry when I would be going to meet my work friends, repeatedly asking me if P would be there. I reassured him that nothing was happening and that me and P were just friends, but one day he got furious when P called me in the middle of the night. He demanded to know why he was calling, and I had no idea. Turns out it was just a butt dial. He turned on me, insisted I was cheating, and proceeded to push me against the wall and demand the truth. I told him he was acting crazy and nothing was happening. He pushed me around some more before storming out of our flat and driving away. I rang my best friend for comfort, but didn't actually have the guts to tell her what had happened, and just ended up having a gossip session. I told her we had an argument and he had left, but no details of the violence he displayed. Jay came back the next morning and apologized. I said it was fine, but he needed to watch his temper, and then we had a normal day and he took me to work that night. A few weeks passed before he was violent again, this time much more serious than before. I had found out I was pregnant, but having had miscarriages before, I waited until I had the ultrasound to tell him. When I did, he went crazy, screaming about how I was a cheat and it wasn't his. I burst out crying, saying I wouldn't do that to him, but he wouldn't listen. He gave me a beating I wouldn't forget and then stormed out the flat again. I was bleeding pretty bad and in a lot of pain. I called my friend and she rushed over as she didn't live very far away. When she arrived, I told her what happened, and then she confided in me that she was in a similar situation with her partner. I found out later that day that the fight we had resulted in me losing our baby. I was in pieces, but terrified. If he could do that to me, knowing I was pregnant, surely he could do anything to me. Time went on with his violent behavior. He beat me and even assaulted me in ways I dare not describe. I didn't want to sleep with him. He accused me of sleeping with other people and then forced me into bed. I had told my friend I was struggling with his behavior and she didn't know what to do. I didn't want to go to the police because at the time I was convinced it was my fault, and he was a good guy really. It was just bringing out the worst in him. I eventually broke things off, and to escape him, I went to stay with some friends in the next town over where he didn't know where I was. This is where it gets really crazy. He started following all my colleagues home from work to find out where I was. This meant I had to keep moving from place to place, but I was scared putting my friends at risk. He dumped all my possessions at my parents' house, telling them I was a cheat and didn't want him anymore as I had found someone else. I eventually went to stay with P, my friend I had mentioned earlier. He told me he wasn't scared and wouldn't let Jay hurt me. Jay followed P home and had his friends follow him too to find out when I was there. He would have people sit outside the house and follow me. He would turn up at random times in the night demanding things like keys for the flat or money for rent. I refused this as I had given my keys back to the real estate agents and explained to them that he had kicked me out, dumping my things at my parents' house. Jay would message me every day saying horrible things like he was going to make me pay and I would regret this. Also, I would get messages or calls from his mother and sister giving me abuse and saying things like they would come get me. He came into my work a few times before the manager banned him for being there whilst I was working. So, he just hung around outside my work waiting for me to finish, when he would hurl abuse at me and call me names. He demanded money off me for quite some time, and I eventually moved home with my parents, but I'm too scared to move out of my own place for fear of him finding me alone. He still to this day tries to find contact with me through social media or coming to my work. He still hangs around outside my work waiting for me, but my managers are kind enough to let me stay when we close and take me home so he can't get me. I really hope he moves on and stops tormenting me and my friends. We were together all around 10 months and the whole thing was too fast and crazy. And I truly hope I never have to go through this ever again. Tonight I missed a meeting with the devil. I'm just going to start by saying that I am fascinated by the paranormal and unexplained mysteries. One of my favorites is the case of Robert Johnson. It's important that you know about him in order for my story to make sense. So I'm sure we've all heard about musicians making a deal with the devil, but perhaps the most famous of these cases is that of blues legend Robert Johnson. Between 1936 and 37, Johnson recorded 29 songs which would go on to become some of the most influential music in history. He was loved by many and people couldn't get enough of his music. But this wasn't always so. When he was younger, Robert would hang around local juke joints where famous musicians would be playing. During rest periods, he would beg them to let him play their guitars, and when they did, he got a lot of complaints about the noise he was making. No one liked his music or his singing, and they made fun of him for his lack of talent. One day, Robert had had enough, and after he was mocked by his own father, he ran away. 6 months later, Johnson returned. Walking into a bar called Banks, Mississippi with a guitar on his back, he made his way to the front. Musician Eddie House recalls asking Robert, "Boy, now where are you going with that thing? To annoy somebody else to death?" Johnson got up on stage and played the best guitar that he had ever heard. By the time he was done, everyone stood with their mouths open in complete awe of Robert's unnatural talent. A few blues musicians, Tommy Johnson, unrelated to Robert, explained the process of selling your soul to the devil. 1. Take your guitar to a crossroads between 12 a.m. and 3 a.m. and start playing. 2. A tall black man will walk up to you, take your guitar, tune it, and hand it back. 3. If you accept the guitar, you will be able to play anything. It was rumored that this is how Robert Johnson acquired his skills, and this was only perpetuated by some of his songs, such as Crossroad Blues, Hellhound on my trail, last fare deal gone down, me and the Devil's Blues, Crossroad, and more. Robert died a year after returning to town at the age of 27. While it is believed that he may have been poisoned by a jealous husband, no one knows how or why he died. However, witnesses who saw him on the day he died said that he was crawling on all fours, barking like a dog. I've always wished I could be a good singer. I dabbled in a bit of guitar here and there, but I'm nowhere near as good as I'd like to be. Couple this with my fascination with the paranormal, and you may not be surprised to learn that I wanted to go to a crossroads at midnight, just out of some dark curiosity. I know nothing will happen, but what if? I thought about it for weeks, and I'd think to myself, I've not got much else to do. Let's just take my guitar and see what happens. There's a crossroads not far from where I live, and it's ideal. It's a perfect cross in the middle of nowhere, and it doesn't get many people passing through even during the day. Last week at about 12:15 on Saturday night, I was driving back from having dinner with my aunt, and I came to a T-junction on my way home. Now, I had a choice between turning left and getting home quicker, but it would be a windy road with a lot of turns and junctions, or I could go right, which would mean an extra 10 minutes, but it's pretty much a straight road and would mean passing by the crossroads that I've been thinking about a lot recently. I decided to turn right. I followed the long straight country road and slowed down as I approached the country roads because I would have to take a right turn, and that's when I saw it. Out of nowhere, I saw a large black shadow figure standing on the driver's side of my car. He wore a flat cap and had a long black coat with his hands in his pockets. He must have been about 7 or 8 feet tall and was right next to my car as I drove past. I only noticed him when I got to about 5 meters from him, but all I could make out of him was his outline. As I continued to drive, I watched him until he went into a blind spot, and when I turned at the junction, he was gone. He had been standing in the open and was now nowhere. It scared the life out of me, if I'm being honest, and made my adrenaline spike. I know what I saw, and I've told a few people about this, and I feel like some of them are humoring me, and the rest think that I must have been seeing things after an hour-long drive, but I wasn't sleepy at all. I was blasting music out loud and singing along as this happened, so what was it? Was it just a tall man standing there waiting for someone to pick him up from the middle of nowhere? Or was the devil really waiting for me to strike a deal with him? They say that you'll never need to call for the devil, because he will come to you before you ask. So something weird happened to me the other day, and I'd like to share it here. For some backstory, my name is Tom, and I'm not going to share my last name for privacy reasons. I live in a very rural part of Pennsylvania where a bunch of coal mines used to be. I live in a neighborhood of houses where each house is about a quarter mile or less away from each other with dense woods in between each house. My street has 10 houses, including my friend Sam, or Samantha's house, who is a part of this too. She is my closest neighbor and friend. We hang out a lot, and in this story, nothing different was happening. We met up between our houses at a tree that we engraved our names into a while back. Anyways, we met up and walked towards her house's direction because that's where the town that we are on the outskirts of is. As we walked, we were talking about Bigfoot. We both believed in stupid urban legends. I teased about the Jersey Devil or the Slender Man or a skinwalker attacking us, and it always scared her, which was amusing me. A noise could be heard behind us. It was an engine of a vehicle. I turned and saw a white Honda Civic. Weird for people around here coming up the road. I turned back thinking nothing of it. As it passed, 2 men stared daggers at us. It was weird, but I shrugged it off. We made it to the edge of town, a 7-Eleven we go to often. In the parking lot, though, the white Honda Civic was there. We walked in and I saw one of the 2 men from earlier at the counter ordering a Slurpee and 2 Twix bars. He saw me enter and frowned, but turned to Sam and smiled. I grabbed her hand and took her immediately to the right of the entrance, where a bunch of magazines and books were. I told her I don't trust those men and that they seemed weird and up to something. I told her about the smile, and she took me a little bit more seriously and told me to loosen up a bit and to not worry about it. Well, I didn't listen and kept on worrying about it. She walked past the entrance again towards the Slurpee machine. As she passed, the man, now walking out with his bag and drink, looked right at her, but it disgusted me, and I looked at him like he just committed a crime. He said, "What are you going to do about it, little guy?" Then walked out. I thought, why would he talk to me like that? I wasn't even a threat to his whole weird idea that looking at underage girls was cool or something. These men now crossed the line, and it bothered me badly. I called my mom to come to us because there were weird men, and she said that she'll be there shortly. Sam came back over with her Coke and cherry mix Slurpee, what she always gets, and got a pretzel. I picked up Twizzlers and paid for everything, being the respectable gentleman I was. As we walked out, I saw the Honda Civic still in its parking spot, but no two men. A feeling of being watched came over me and creeped me out. I told Sam, "Hey, let's meet my mom on her way here by starting to walk." She shrugged and said okay. I opened my Twizzlers and munched on them as we walked onto the road leaving town. Trees started to come over us as we walked further. Soon enough, we both heard footsteps in the woods to our left. We turned and saw a man. I haven't seen this man before, so we were creeped out. I said, "Sir, do you need assistance?" Hoping that that was the case and not a "I'm here to hurt you" case. He then sprinted at us, and I dropped my Twizzlers and Sam dropped her pretzel and Slurpee and we ran. I then heard an engine behind us. I turned and saw the man turn around, now running towards a white Honda Civic. The man in the store was in the driver's seat. I was speechless. I knew something was up with these people from the start. I told Sam to run faster and that it's the men from the 7-Eleven. We ran as the white Honda Civic pulled ahead of us and the men got out. I grabbed Sam's hand and pulled her behind me. I wanted to show as much dominance as possible. One said, "Oh, look at that. He's protecting his girlfriend." I shouted back she's not my girlfriend, and I called the police. The one man then pulled out a knife and said, "I don't want to hurt you, but if you're resisting, I will." They started to approach as lights shone from behind them. It was my mom. She pulled up in front of us, obstructing our view of the men. Me and Sam got in and she pulled away. We drive home safely, not seeing those men or the white Honda Civic again. But what I do know is, I will start carrying a knife around with me everywhere, and a message for everyone reading. Be careful out there. There are crazy people, creepy people out there. My guess is these men were traffickers, but I don't know, and I'm thankful I never will. As a preface to the story, I would like to mention that this is one of my father's spine-chilling Korean War stories, but since today is his birthday, he would have been 86, I thought this would be a good time to share it. During the Korean War, my father was a medic on the front. Basically, he described it as dodging non-stop onslaughts of explosions and bullets while trying to help as many fallen soldiers as he could, while listening to their agonizing screams of "Medic! Medic!" Most of the time, there wasn't even anything he could do for them, so you can imagine the trauma he went through. One night, many years ago, long before he died, he told me a story that to this day still gives me chills. He told me that when he wasn't on the front trying to save lives, he would be back at the base camp assisting doctors and basically doing whatever he was ordered to do. For obvious reasons, he tried not to get too close to anyone, but the constant stress he was under made it impossible not to have a few close buddies. They would mostly just exchange stories about back home, share letters, bum cigarettes off of each other, and kick a ball around during their breaks. According to my dad, one of the most dreaded assignments was a night duty in the foxhole, especially during the winter. He said the cold, hard ground was like lying in an icy tomb, and given the near-death experiences he suffered on a regular basis, the idea of climbing into the hole was a nightmare in and of itself. Inside the hand-dug holes, the temperature could get well below zero, but with a combined body heat of a few men, it was far warmer than outside. Once inside the foxhole, the next worst thing was going back out to pee. He and his buddies would take secluded turns that were pretty well spaced out so they wouldn't be moving around and making too much noise. Stealth and silence were essential to survival, but he had been with this group for a while and they made a pretty good team. So he told me that one night it was particularly cold. For the first time, he had decided to forgo drinking some of his water rations that day so he wouldn't need to pee and just skip his turn crawling out of the foxhole to relieve himself. The night went by as expected, cold and uncomfortable, eyes and ears fixed for any possible movement, and the occasional silent communication among the group using hand and facial gestures. It was getting close to 4 a.m., his turn to crawl out to pee. The sergeant in command beckoned him to get ready to go, and he motioned that he didn't need to, but instead of getting the anticipated "suit yourself" reply, he got the "that's an order" silent gesture. He knew that there was absolutely no arguing against an order, so reluctantly, he crawled out of the hole on his belly. At the designated points, he rose to his knees and continued to the area assigned for the soldiers to relieve themselves. Obviously, given the circumstances, he went ahead and quietly did so. When he finished, he retraced his path in the same manner, crawling on his knees and then back down on his belly. Suddenly, he stopped dead in his tracks. He heard a crack clear as day. His body was shivering on the freezing ground, but he didn't move an inch. He waited. He heard it again. It sounded like a branch snapping and the soft crush of dry leaves. Something or someone was definitely out there. He couldn't decide if he should just sit tight or try and make his way back to the foxhole. He calculated that he was no more than 12 or 15 feet away from the hole, but he might as well have been 100 yards away. His mind was racing. If it was an animal, then the joke would be on him, but if it was the enemy, he didn't want to accidentally give away the foxhole's location, but at the same time, he desperately wanted to warn his buddies. And what he said felt like an eternity, but what was probably no more than a minute. He lay perfectly still, listening and debating what course of action to take. And then he heard the voices. They were extremely quiet, but loud enough for him to hear Korean. It sounded like they were moving away from his position. He was overwhelmed with relief, but kept his cool and quietly started crawling back to the foxhole, all the while trying to imagine the best gestures to use to let his group know what he had just witnessed and that the enemy was near. The moon was bright enough to affect his vision when he crawled back into the foxhole. Just inside, he waited a moment for his eyes to begin adjusting to the pitch dark. He still couldn't see his hand in front of his face, but he wanted to get back into position and away from the cold air seeping in through the foxhole opening. Careful not to run into anyone, he eased onto his hands and knees. The ground felt icy cold. Slowly he began to crawl towards his spot, but immediately the hand he put his weight on slipped and he lost his balance. His upper body fell hard against the ground. When he tried to pull himself back up, he slipped again, but this time he could feel it and he could smell it. Terrified, he panicked. The more he tried to just get up, the more he slipped and slithered. The warmth, the smell of iron, and the horrific silence were more than his eyes ever needed to see. They were all dead. In a sneak attack, the enemy had surprised his buddies and cut their throats, while he had been ordered out to pee. I live in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. It was a Tuesday night. I was lying on my bed trying to get some sleep. I lay there for about 3 hours until I decided to get up and take a walk around my neighborhood just to clear my head. It was 2 in the morning. I was walking down the street when I remembered there is an abandoned building in our neighborhood. I decided to visit it. People say that this building is haunted. I always wanted to see what was inside that building. The building itself looked really creepy. Broken windows, a huge metal door which said no entry with red paint. As an 18-year-old college student, I wanted to be adventurous. I climbed through one of the broken windows and got inside the building. I took out my phone and started to record so I could show off in front of my friends. Just let you guys know, my phone works completely fine and there's no problem in it. The place was really dark. The only source of light in that building was from my phone. It took me a couple of seconds to realize I was inside a small room. I walked out the door into the hallway. It was an apartment. I was doing commentary while recording to make it look cool. I got out of the apartment and into the main hall of the building. On the left side of the elevator, there is a small passageway which leads to a really small room under the stairs. I went there to investigate. When I got close to the room, I heard a clicking noise coming from the first floor. I was frozen for a split second. I walked back to the main hall, still recording. Then I heard a loud sound of metal dropping on concrete. I almost crapped my pants. I wanted to get out of there, but something inside of me told me to go upstairs and find out what it was. I started walking up the stairs as slowly as I could. I don't even know what I was expecting to see up there. I got to the first floor, and as expected, it was dark, but it got colder. Now, this event took place in the middle of August. It was hot outside. I'm into paranormal stuff, and when I suddenly felt the cold, I knew this place is not a joke. I should have turned back, but I wanted to see where that sound had come from. There were 4 apartments on each floor. I investigated all 4 of them and saw nothing. A chill ran down my spine when I realized that the whole first floor and the ground floor is covered in sand. There's no concrete and no sign of anything metal. The cold temperature on that floor and the fact that I was alone gave me the chills. I hurried down the stairs, made my way back to the apartment, got out of the window and ran my way back home. When I got home, I drank gallons of water, calmed myself down, and took out my phone. I wanted to hear that sound again, so I played the video, and to my horror, the audio in the video was messed up. My commentary wasn't there at all. Like I said, there was no problem with my phone. It works fine. I was so scared that I couldn't sleep that night. I told my friends about it, and they told me that it was really stupid to go inside that building alone. I didn't delete the video. I decided to keep it as a memory. Fast forward to December, I was going through my gallery and I came across that video. I decided to play it. I forwarded it to the part where I heard the sound, and surprisingly that sound is clearly heard in the video. I don't know how, but it could be heard clearly. I got goosebumps and closed my phone. I promised myself not to go near that building ever again. It was Friday night, and I had just gotten home from spending the whole day with Jay, my boyfriend and now husband. At the time, I lived with my mom, stepdad, and triplet brothers in a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom condo. My family was going through some hard times, and that was all we could afford at the time. I shared the master bedroom with the triplets, so each of us had a twin bed. 2 of the beds were on each side of the room, and the third under one bed that could be pulled out when needed. And the 4th, my bed, was at the foot of the second bed, making a backwards L shape that faced the bedroom door. Fast forward to about 11 p.m., we say our goodnights and go to bed. And I'm exhausted from a long day. Fell asleep as soon as my head hit the pillow. And this is where things get scary. I can't exactly remember if I was dreaming or not, but I do remember clear as day getting woken up to what felt like someone pinning me down with their hands on each shoulder and their knee in the middle of my back. I could feel my blood running with fear. As it leaned over, it whispered, "Are you awake?" I felt paralyzed, couldn't seem to move or open my eyes. I tried to scream, but all my efforts were useless. Even though I couldn't move, I did feel like I was going to poop myself. That's how scared I was. I again heard the same creepy, sinister voice say this, and this time in a loud whisper, "I know you're awake." Again, I try not to move, but all I could do is pray. As I'm praying for this to stop, I hear the most evil, malicious, vile laugh I have ever heard in my life. I could hear my heart and blood racing. I slowly start gaining control of myself. I manage to sit up. It's dark, but the outside light is bright enough to where I can see where everything is, and that's when I see him, or it, the shadow of a man in what looks to be a trench coat. Now, I can't really say in detail what it or he looked like because it looked like a shadow walking by, and just like that, it disappeared. About 5 minutes go by, and I'm now sitting up. I look over to the triplets, and they are all sound asleep. Now, I know you guys might think I had some type of sleep paralysis, and I know for sure that was not the case. The next morning, I joined my parents for breakfast when I start telling them about my terrifying experience. The story grabs one of my brothers, we'll call him Chris, attention. As I continue with my story, Chris starts walking towards us, and before I could tell him about the evil laugh, he blurts out, "The laugh! You heard the laugh? It was an evil manly laugh. It made me jump out of my sleep. But when I looked over, there was nobody there. I closed my eyes and heard movements on your side of the room, so I peeked and I saw you just sitting up. I wanted to say something and I wasn't sure myself what that was." Shivers went down my spine. Everyone was freaking out, thinking someone may have broken in. We double-checked everywhere for signs of a break-in and found nothing. We have since moved and are living better lives, but if anyone has ever had an experience similar to mine, please share. Or if you have an idea of what it was, please let me know. I also forgot to mention that prior to this happening, my upstairs neighbor ended their life and he wasn't found till about a week later. Maybe that has something to do with it. So the last time I detailed some small instances where the bond between my mama and me saved my life when I was a baby. But I also mentioned that there always seemed to be something pulling me away from her. And today I was going to go into more detail about that. This story is the one Mama told me in most detail, but I know there are more. As I may have mentioned before, I was more on the quiet side as a kid, even as a toddler. Mom wasn't much of a fan of leaving me at kindergarten all day or such either, so since I was so quiet, she tended to pick me up right after work and ran errands with me by her side. Of course, this meant she made sure that I knew some rules of behavior and stuck to them. I knew that I wasn't to leave her side without asking first. I wasn't to leave her line of sight. Going with strangers or accepting anything from them without her permission was a taboo, and I obeyed rules surprisingly well as a kid, so I typically stuck close to her. I also was very particular about traffic etiquette, to the point where I absolutely scolded my mom for it if she ever tried to cross a red light. One day, we were running errands again and currently finishing shopping at the grocery store. Mom was at a table by the entrance and exit door to pack our things. She had to let go of my hand for that, but she kept checking that I was there. Suddenly, she noticed the door opening and closing. It's a heavy door one needs to push from the inside. The grocery store still exists, still has that door, and when going there last year, I, as an adult, had to put quite some weight into it to open it. But no adult had exited or entered. Instead, Mama looked up to see me running at full speed towards the busy street. Of course, she screamed and immediately went to try and follow me, but the door wouldn't budge. She vividly remembers another adult noticing and trying to help her, but even together, they could not open the door. She watched in horror as I darted in between the parked cars towards the asphalt. Fortunately, I was scooped up at this moment by a man who seemed to come out of nowhere. I personally am fairly sure that he was probably exiting his car as he had just parked or something when he spotted me and jumped into action. Mom was probably just so focused on me that she didn't see him sooner. Still, he had amazing timing, and weirdly, I turned completely calm when he held me and stepped towards the store. The door suddenly opened normally and Mom could stumble out and take me into her arms, upset and crying that she almost lost her baby. I don't know what happened afterwards, aside from a few other patrons of the store comforting her and us going home, and I myself don't remember much from the incident. I feel like I saw something across the street that I absolutely needed to get to. My behavior was especially weird because not only did I absolutely adore my parents and usually stuck super close to them, I also didn't usually run anywhere unless I was in a panic trying to catch up to someone or playing catch. In fact, my kindergarten teachers always had to fall back to herd me back to the group because I usually walked extremely slow, looking at the ground at all times. The only way Mama could make me keep pace with her was by making a game out of walking in sync with each other. Yet she describes my movement back then like someone was pulling me on a string. I was completely focused on something across the street, moving so fast, she still feels physically ill just thinking about it. I'm really glad that this man spotted me in time. If not for him, I wouldn't be here anymore. These stories aren't mine, they're my boyfriend's. He had never told me about these incidents until last night when we started talking about weird experiences. Now, this happened when my boyfriend was much younger, I'd say probably around 11. He often went to visit his cousin down in a small town in Colorado. His cousin used to live near the local high school. This comes into play later in the story. The two of them would often go on what they called midnight adventures. Basically, they would wait until the later hours of the night, then they would take their bikes out and ride around the town, going to restaurants and getting food, just cruising around town finding things to do. This particular night they had been out for a while. They had just got done going to McDonald's to have the breakfast after midnight special they had been putting on at the time. They were riding their bikes next to a park that had a fence around it, and suddenly they noticed a massive white dog that resembled a husky barrel out of nowhere towards them. They both were startled as it seemed to come out of nowhere, so they rode faster, parallel to the fence. As they rode, the dog came running on the other side of the fence, matching their pace. But as they reached the end of the fence, it disappeared. They hesitantly stopped to look around for the dog, but it was nowhere to be seen. Freaked out, they decided to go back home, but they were on the opposite side of town from their house. Boyfriend's cousin says that he knows a shortcut through an alleyway. This alley is narrow and has a singular streetlight at the end. As they turn and begin to go down the alleyway, guess what's sitting under the street lamp? The white dog. It just sits there looking at them. They decided to nope out of there and go around. As they turn the corner of the street, they see the dog still under the street lamp staring. Then the street lamp turns off. They decide to hightail it out of there and they make it back home without any more incidences. This next story also happened during one of those midnight adventures. The two had just gone out for the night and they decided to go to the high school parking lot to mess around. Since they had bikes, they figured it would be a good spot to ride around since it was flat and well lit. Suddenly, my boyfriend sees a man in dark clothes walking through the opposite side of the parking lot. At first, he thinks nothing of it until he takes a closer look. The man was a reasonable distance away from them, yet he seemed tall. He said he was probably 8 feet at least. Boyfriend quietly asks cousin if he's seeing the man too, and he confirms. The man continues walking down the parking lot until he reaches a light post. He walks behind the light post and disappears. He doesn't come out the other side. Boyfriend and cousin freak out and decide they have had enough already. They instantly turn around to go home. Last story my boyfriend told me was not part of the Midnight Adventure saga, but instead it occurred when he was way younger. Boyfriend was probably 8, living with his mom and sister. His sister and he shared a room and bed. Back then, both the boyfriend and the sister had a very bad habit of sleepwalking. One night, boyfriend's sister sits up out of bed and looks at a corner. At first, boyfriend thinks that she's awake, but soon realizes her eyes are still closed. Suddenly, she jumps out of bed and starts screaming, "How did you get in here? What do you want?" In between, she takes a blanket and covers boyfriend, all the while looking in one corner saying, "Don't hurt him." She starts screaming for their mom, who comes busting in the room, flicking the lights on, and there was no one there. All the commotion caused the sister to finally wake up. She claims she swore someone was in the room with them. So these events took place around 4 years ago. At the time, I was living with my girlfriend in a pretty dumpy house out in the country. This was in a particular area that people referred to as meth country, though I'm sure many areas hold that description. There was a lot of strange characters and houses that were just metal shacks with junk strewn about the properties. To add to the sketchy nature of this area, there was dozens of dogs that seemed to just run wild. Someone likely owned many of them, but they were all without collars and were quite mangy and dirty. However, there was this one dog in particular that has always stuck with me. The first time I encountered it, I was outside of our house weed whacking, and as I finished up one side of the house, I turned and had a small heart attack when I saw the most intimidating dog I'd ever seen running towards me. It looked like some kind of mix of pit bull and Rottweiler, and looked like one big muscle. Its head was literally the size of a pumpkin. However, it just kind of ran up to me and was seeming to just want to play. His tail was wagging uncontrollably, and it would roll on its back to expose its stomach to me. After my nerves settled, I started petting it, and it was actually a big sweetheart. However, despite it being quite friendly, it was really disgusting. It smelled awful, and whenever it exposed its stomach, I could see flies and bugs blanketing its underside. After giving it some attention for a bit, I saw something in my peripherals that caused me to glance at the left. There was this large black dog standing completely still, just staring at me. I know it sounds cliché, but it really looked similar to a black wolf. It was some sort of mutt, but just to give a better description, I'd guess that it had some German Shepherd, some type of hound, and maybe some black lab in its lineage. It had very long legs and was probably around 100 pounds or more or less. It was kind of unnerving how it looked at me. It just made me feel uneasy. It stood probably 100 feet away, and I tried to coax it over to me, but its tail never even twitched. It just stood there as if it were made of stone. After it looked at me for maybe a minute, it just turned and trotted away behind a wall of brush that ran parallel to the road, and when it did, the friendly beast of a dog got off the road and ran to catch up with it. I would see this dog every few weeks or so, and what always creeps me out about it was that I would always catch it staring me down, not knowing how long it had been watching me. My girlfriend told me how she had seen it a few times as well and how much it creeped her out. My encounters with it grew more frequent over the passing months to where I started to see it nearly every day. Sometimes I'd be outside and would catch it looking at me from a distance, and other times I would actually step outside to see it across the road, looking directly towards my front door. It eventually became routine to where I'd walk out of my house in the morning and head to class or work, and it would be waiting. While at this point it had never done anything that caused much harm, aside from being plain creepy, I was starting to get really creeped out by this thing. There was one incident that happened in the last month or so of our lease that kept me from going outside unless it was to leave for somewhere, and even then I would book it to my car. One morning, I was cleaning out my car. I had let it get pretty cluttered and dirty and was just getting all the trash, clothes, and other miscellaneous things I had left in there. While I was cleaning out the back and under the passenger seat, I heard a sound coming from the house. I looked back and my girlfriend was frantically pounding on the window and pointing behind me. I turned, and the dog was prowling towards me while crouched low, almost like a cat would when stalking a prey. It was maybe 30 feet away, and adrenaline hit me when it went into a dead sprint towards me. I remember hopping in the back of my car and slamming the door shut. It reached the side and it just stared at me through the window with these dead eyes. It just looked like it hated me. Not even like it was hungry and wanted to eat, but like it just wanted to kill me. I know that sounds kind of stupid, but it didn't really have any excitement in its eyes or body language. It didn't paw at the windows or make any sound. It just stood still as it always had. I eventually triggered the car's alarm with my key set, and it calmly trotted off after a few seconds. We promptly called animal control since it seemed to make a deliberate attempt to harm me. We gave them a description, but since there was a lot of dense forest in the area, they couldn't locate him. None of the nearby residents claimed the dog as their own. I'm pretty sure if any of them did own it, they would lie to avoid any legal consequences. Animal control searched for a good while, and after coming up empty, told us to call them back if we ever saw it again. I don't think they took it very seriously, to be honest. I saw it 2 more times before we left. It would be standing near the spot I first saw it, just barely visible in the street lights while facing my house. Both of the last sightings were very late at night, so I just didn't feel like bothering with animal control again, since they probably wouldn't be able to track it down in the dark. I don't know whatever happened with that dog. We moved out a few weeks early, and I just wanted to put it out of my mind. I do sometimes have nightmares about it and the way it looked at me through my car window. It was the only time in my life I truly felt like I was prey. I'm just glad to be far away from it. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. And if you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.